JJ, it's great to meet you. I'm familiar with your work. I was introduced to your work through friend of the stream and your friend as well, Greg, Dreg, or J-Reg as people may know him. Huge fan of his stuff. I know you are too.
Indeed.
I wonder if for my audience, you could give an introduction to your work and a little bit of your background.
Okay, so I sort of have two parallel jobs that I tend to lead with, depending on who I'm talking to. I'll pick a different one. So I'm a professional YouTuber. Maybe that's more interesting to your audience. So I've been making YouTube videos every week for about 6 years or so. I live here in Vancouver, Canada. And Canadian commentary, Canadian cultural commentary is a big part of what I do on my channel. I also talk a lot about sort of American cultural issues, sort of the three C's I mention in my sort of tagline for my channel is I talk about countries, culture, and Canada. And those are kind of like the big categories that I think most of my video content falls into in one way or another. I'm not a super duper like serious video essayist type. But I feel like, I do commentary that's a bit more sort of substantial, I think, than some of the more kind of frivolous stuff. But that's sort of like one sort of side of me. And then the other side of me is I'm also a weekly columnist at the Washington Post. I work for what is called the Global Opinions section, sort of representing Canada. I'm one of their sort of Canadian representatives. And the way I describe what I do there is I write about Canadian politics for a global audience. So I write about Canadian issues in a way that is hopefully accessible to both Canadians and international readers without being too condescending to either either group. So, and that in turn sort of reflects a kind of larger arc of my professional career, which is that I have been, a kind of pundit commentator type. I've been writing and doing commentary on Canadian television and the radio and so on for at least a decade or so now. So yeah, I'm kind of got one foot in kind of old media world in terms of working for this very legacy newspaper. And then I've got obviously one foot in sort of new media world in terms of being a YouTuber.
You do. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons I guess there's a number of reasons why I wanted to talk to you because, as an artist, I've spent a lot of time working in institutional structures in universities and academia. And then in the last, let's say 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years now, I've been making a lot of content and I find myself on the platforms and there are no editors and no gatekeepers. And I wanted to talk about some of the affordances of those different spaces and the kind of discourse that they create and this type of thing. But I think as a broad intro to the conversation we're going to have today. You recently wrote an article in the Washington Post. It's an opinion piece, Are Millennial Leftists Aging into Right-Wingers? And this is bait for Josh, because this is the topics that I really, really love to talk about. I think you're familiar with a bunch of my stuff now because we've had a few conversations in advance of this. But the topics that really interest me now and the unique affordances of the art space is to talk about broad ideological shifts and to scale jump and to really get experimental or utopian with our thinking. And we seem to be at a period where there is an ideological political shift, maybe a historical shift. We're at a very unique period of history. And I've spent the last few years talking to young people who are very engaged in meme, political, subculture type of communities. And I chart their political journey from spaces on the left to the right and vice versa, and all across the political spectrum. So I've spent the last few years at the fringes of the Overton window. And then maybe you've been in the center of it, talking more so about not in a 40-year arc, but in like a 4-year arc, doing political commentary. Yeah, and sure. I think on this particular article, we are converging our interests, and I think it'll be a generative conversation. Can I ask you to give a brief summary of the article for people who have not yet read it?
Yeah. So, I mean, I should probably sort of lay down some of my cards just ahead of time as well. So most of my sort of political commentary that I've done has been within sort of what I would describe as broadly center-right spaces in both Canada and the US. I actually spent a year working and writing for National Review, the kind of preeminent conservative journal of opinion in America. So I am observing the left as much more of an outsider. And that was very much sort of what animated the writing of that column. I have consumed sort of aggressively kind of left-wing media. I think it's important to sort of consume a broad range of opinions. And what I've just noticed, though, is in consuming some of this aggressively sort of leftist American media, I have noticed a tendency where it does seem like that there is a bit of an arms race on the left in America these days, left-wing commentators to just talk about how much they hate Democrats. And like that becomes like the defining theme of the commentary more than anything else. It's like, all of the Democrats suck. I hate Biden. I hate Pelosi. I hate Schumer. They're all terrible. They're all corrupt. They do nothing for anyone. They're objectively the worst, the worst, the worst. And sometimes it crosses the line. That sort of rhetoric, it's so intense sometimes that it even comes around. And then you start having people saying like, and yeah, all they do is they bitch about Trump and he wasn't really that bad. And they're just like so hysteric. And they just use this as a way to like whip everybody up into a fury. Oh, Trump, he's the devil. He's the devil. And, you know, like at some point to me, this style of rhetoric, which seems to be very popular in explicitly leftist spaces, starts to become a little indistinguishable, frankly, from conservative commentary. And so when I look at the demographic of some of the people that are producing this kind of commentary that is, you know, endlessly beating up on the Democrats and engaging in some light Trump apologia, I dare say, I start to wonder if maybe this is less of an ideological phenomenon and maybe more of just a kind of phase of life that a lot of people tend to go through, which is, you know, it's kind of a bit of a cliche, the idea that people tend to get more conservative as they get older. But I think it's not one that we should dismiss simply because it is a cliche. You know, I think that you were speaking before about how, you know, we're in a sort of remarkable, unique political moment. And I mean, I think that's true to an extent. But on the other hand, I think that the phenomenon in American culture of people who were once like strident members of the proud left drifting into conservative Republican politics as they get older is a pretty well documented one. You know, I mentioned how I used to work at National Review. National Review famously had a lot of sort of post-communists as part of its founding generation of editors. You know, men like Whittaker Chambers and James Berman and people like that used to be sort of strident members of the sort of pre-World War II, I think, kind of leftist generation, and then they drifted over to the right. You know, they went from sort of being Trotskyites who were opposed to Stalin to just kind of like people that were opposed to the Soviet regime overall, and then, you know, sort of drifted into, you know, quote unquote neoconservatism and stuff like that. You had a similar phenomenon with, you know, like sort of 60s radicals, you know, the people that are today the boomers that we regard as being the most kind of like regressive and sort of a reactionary demographic. But, you know, these were the people that were doing the sit-ins and the protesting the Vietnam War and so on and so forth. And you have people like, say, somebody like David Horowitz, you know, former editor of, Ramparts magazine, you know, very strident leftist magazine in the 60s. You look at him now and he's this, you know, quite, I think, obnoxious sort of Trump Republican. And, you know, it's this, and the same thing, like, you know, and David Brooks wrote a remarkable book that I was very fond of called Bobos in Paradise, which was largely about sort of documenting how a lot of the boomers kind of were able to make peace with, you know, they were able to make peace with their sort of bohemian kind of countercultural identities, and then sort of new forms of capitalist sort of commerce and so forth that emerged in like the 80s and 90s and so forth, the kind of the Ben and Jerry's kind of flavor of capitalism, if we want to describe it. So what I'm sort of trying to get at in that column is just that this is a phenomenon that has long that has occurred repeatedly throughout American history, is that people that identify very strongly on the left start drifting into the right. And part of the way that they do that, like the path that they go down in that regard, is that it begins with sort of an underlying sense of contempt for their own tribe, which increasingly becomes more and more virulent to the point where that becomes the entirety of their political identity. And then they start to become a little Republican, a little conservative curious, if nothing else. And then before you know it, what started off as kind of a slight open-mindedness becomes an unironic political identity.
There are so many factors that go into this that I'm taking a few notes as you talk. So let me try and not miss any of these things as we move forward. Speaking of the millennial left, and I feel like there's an intellectual peer group of podcasters and things like this, right? So I'm trying to bracket out if we're talking about millennial voters who are disenfranchised with the Bernie campaign or something like that, and now there's a sense of identity or like a tribal affiliation that becomes so consuming, and they basically irony poison themselves into then becoming the other side, right? They're entangled inextricably with the Democratic Party. That frustration is so overwhelming that they make a 180. In a two-party system, you just vote the other direction. So that's one part of it. Tribal affiliation is important. But then there's also this question of history. And I think that it's important to evaluate these things on the very unlevel playing field that we currently are on. So bracketing out things like radical politics now, a lot of those seemed like common sense politics in the 1970s, right? So the idea to wind back the clock before neoliberalism is not a radical idea, but given the shifting Overton window of the past few years, we find ourselves much further down the spectrum to privatization. And this is where maybe the JREG and the politogram conversations start to come in, because evaluating these things in terms of left versus right begins to feel insufficient, and we now need to set up an XY grid of, in a very LARPy, silly kind of way, authoritarianism to libertarianism, but maybe there's a cultural progressivism and a cultural conservatism, and we just need more dimensions of resolution to be able to get more granular with the conversation. So let me throw a few questions at you, and then you can kind of choose how you want to respond to these, because I feel like there's different points, and I appreciate that you're writing in a rather brief format, because I've done it as well. This is going to be read by, a million people at the scale that it gets published. So you want to have a very concise thing, but you have to compress a lot of information into these sentences. So, for example, I can think of a Marxist organization in Chicago, but is organized really all around the world, maybe primarily in Germany now. I'm thinking of the Platypus Affiliated Society, the chief pedagogue of which released an essay in, I think, 2016 called Why Not Trump? And this was a somewhat satirical provocation of, how bad are the Democrats? Like, is it a useful thought experiment to just push yourself to the other side? And that sounds very much aligned with what you're talking about, but the size of that group is something like, I want to say, a few hundred people. And my sense is that in the article you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people making a relatively small leap across the Overton window to vote in the other direction, rather than like a Marxist shift from being a Trotskyist in the 1920s to then becoming like a neocon or a member of the Reagan administration. Yeah, but it is possible that in the period of a similar ideological transformation, maybe the Trotskyist to neocon pipeline, or the counterculture to cyberculture, which is maybe a more recent version of this, people drifting left to right, very broadly using those terms. Is there a trickle-down effect where those big ideological shifts then result in people making the relatively small leap and voting the other direction? What is the sense of the audience that you have in mind? Are we talking about hundreds of people, or are we talking about millions?
Well, I suppose the way that I was sort of thinking about it is the idea of kind of elite thought leaders kind of creating a permission structure to their audience.
Are we elite thought leaders right now doing a podcast?
We are. Yes, of course we are, because we're on a podcast and we're talking about politics, right? Like, it's not something that normal people do. But, if you think that, people that have podcasts or YouTube channels or Twitch streams or very popular, Twitter accounts or whatever, if they're consistently pushing certain types of rhetoric, then that does trickle down. And it does, as I said, create a permission structure in which, a sort of broad audience of voters are sort of enabled to maybe indulge in political curiosities that they might have otherwise felt some stigma towards. So if you consider yourself, a person of the left, and yet you're consuming media that does nothing but, hate on Democrats, and maybe even, apologize for Trump or make excuses for Trump or suggest that he's not so bad and that the modern Republican Party, has some things going for it. At least they're principled, at least they say what they mean, at least they're honest. You hear this kind of rhetoric all the time. And so what I'm just kind of saying is that if you sort of layer on that permission structure coming from a sort of high level intellectual place, coupled with the general inclination of, I think, people to get more conservative as they get older, as they own property, as they have families, and frankly, just as you start to lose touch a bit with the culture of the youth, right? If you think of people, in their 30s like us, who are getting older. I'm close to 40 now. And it's true. Like, you do start to realize that it becomes harder to stay on top, particularly in the realm of social issues. It becomes harder to relate to the sort of causes that are animating young people. It becomes harder to understand, the language of young people, the priorities of young people and so forth. So you do there is a kind of fuddy-duddy-ism that sets in. And then that can be sort of rationalized politically as well. And I talk about this in my column, right? I think that, for example, when we think of the boomers and their sort of descent into sort of conservatism, one thing that I remember, because I'm a gay man, and so I remember very much sort of the debate over gay rights and gay marriage, particularly in the early 2000s. And I remember that there was a lot of boomers in those days who would come out and sort of say, I supported feminism, I supported civil rights back in the day. Those were legitimate causes. This business of men marrying men, that's just crazy postmodern nonsense. I did my part fighting for what mattered. I'm not going to go sign up for this latest lunatic crusade that all of the crazy kids are into. And I feel I hear that same kind of rhetoric, for example, when it comes to trans rights in some corners of the identified left, right? It's kind of I fought for gay marriage. Gay marriage made a lot of sense. It was an important cause. But now the kids are talking about, anyone can be anything and all gender is meaningless and what are your pronouns and blah, 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 blah. And I hear a kind of contempt that I think is in part informed just by a process of aging and finding the causes of the youth of today kind of alienating and weird and uncomfortable for a lot of people. And, and I think I think much more than the economic issues, a kind of imagined revulsion at the social priorities of the kind of the new progressivism that, we see on social media and in the schools and elsewhere and stuff. I feel like a lot of self-identified leftists do feel a degree of revulsion towards this kind of new social politics, and are using that in part a way to kind of rationalize their own drift away from it.
Hmm. Okay, so this is very interesting. Okay, because I feel like there's two things that are bundled up here, and I'm going to try and untether them, and you let me know if this sounds accurate to you.
Yep.
Because I feel like there's tribal affiliation, which is very important. And there's something that I would probably agree with here, that there's a very influential group of media figures that identify as left and spend a lot of time constructing an identity around hating the Democratic Party, which is, to be honest, totally fun and engaging. But that becomes permission for people to then explore other types of identities, right? There's a cultural avant-garde that is taking shape in this media formation. I'm curious also if you have particular podcasts or streams or content creators in mind. Let me just read this quote for a piece of context, because the article opens, quote, "I was listening to a podcast the other day featuring two hard left Americans in their late 30s. I won't name names, but you know the type. Socialist intellectuals who use terms like dissident to describe themselves." So I understand it's political if we talk about somebody else on a podcast. I think everyone has a general sense of who these characters are. But if there's somebody you want to name to peg this to, it would maybe be useful. But this is my other contention, is that those tribal affiliations and basically who you are based on the media you consume, really influential, right? But there is the second question, which is who then gets politically activated. And of the, say, for example, 10 million listeners to a popular podcast, do 1 million of them go out and vote in a certain direction? Is it a 10% rate of activation, a 10% conversion rate? Is it 20%? Is it 5%? And those numbers really skew. You have to do a very qualitative read on these things, because one of these, say, for example, my favorite thing that I wrote about this for The Guardian, and the entire media slept on it and forgot about it, that Destiny, the Twitch streamer, was for 2 weekends in a row the largest canvassing operation during the Georgia Senate runoffs, and bigger than the fucking Democratic Party. And nobody knew about it, apparently. No one wrote about it. And I wrote about it, I don't know, 3-6 months later, something. And this was totally shocking to the editors and no one else. But it would seem that is, an astronomical conversion rate of just audience size to on the ground activation. And that dwarfs some really, really large channels in an important way. So, okay, but before I lose track of the more important point here, one could consider, say, the worst case scenario of this is that there are large media channels that are actually that have very low activation rates, are not able to mobilize their followings to actually vote or canvass or do anything. And then the sliding ground, the tilted ground that we're on, is actually that when you talk about aging, I think you're also lumping in the accumulation of wealth, which is
Yes.
what you've said in a few instances, right? You accumulate property, and just as you get older, you have a few things, you want to safeguard what you have. I think that the process of privatization and working life in both of our countries has been so degrading and is on such a steep downward trajectory that my sense is that the people who are being, in the Marxist term, proletarianized, but something that you and I care about very much, actually, the rapid erosion of the middle class and opportunity to move up in the world, that is declining so quickly that I think people, they may not make that leap. As they get older, they may not accumulate wealth. And so they won't have much to safeguard in terms of, say, voting from a working class position to like voting in the position of being a small business owner, right? This is also just not to get too meta on it, but like you and I are like almost the same age, and we're both white men from upper middle class backgrounds who comment on politics. And I'm obviously on the left, you're on the right, but we are of this same demographic that the political content creators are like contesting over, right? Like opinions are being swayed, and those are the people who can be moved between these right, left, if that is useful, political parties of like, what is in your material interest?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Like if you were purely motivated to safeguard your own material interest, does that vote align with the Democrats or the Republicans? And in the era of like post-heterodox Trump, a lot of these policies that sounded interested in just satisfying your like base material needs that were not represented by the Democratic Party, the idea of like bringing back jobs and opportunity and reshoring industry and everybody getting healthcare, like that 2016 rhetoric, that's a shift, and we're still playing out the effects, the cascading effects of that realignment. So I gave you a lot there, but let me ask you about the question of history. Do you feel like that's a fair assessment? And maybe that's the most vital of the questions that I put forward.
I mean, one thing, though, that I just wanted to add in response to the previous thing, because I think you did hit on something that was very, very critical, right? When I'm talking about permission structures, I do think it is very important that sort of we understand the Trumpist, like you sort of said, kind of like post-Reaganite, populist, working man's appeal, mobilization of the white working class, all of, this sort of traditional cliches, bringing back the job and all that. That becomes another permission structure, right? There becomes a new permission structure that frames the Trumpified Republican Party as basically not being like the old-time Republican Party, and in many ways, quote unquote, not being as bad from a progressive perspective as the old Reaganite Republican Party.
Sorry, as bad in terms of what? As bad in
well,
terms
like
of...
if you're coming at this from a left-wing perspective, where you believe that sort of like the great sin of the Republican Party from Reagan onward has been its kind of like naked, unapologetic embrace of neoliberalism, of Reaganomics, of ultra-capitalist, deregulation, all this kind of thing, right? Like if you believe globalization and so on, if you believe that was the worst thing about the Republican Party, then you cannot help but look at a Trumpified Republican Party that has rejected a lot of that orthodoxy as being newly attractive, right?
Totally.
Whether or not Trump, in power actually proceeded to fulfill that mandate is, I think, something that I think the left should be a little bit more, some of these left-wing people that we're discussing should perhaps be a little bit more critical of, and perhaps hold Trump a little bit more accountable to what degree his rhetoric actually matched his actions. But that's, that's a sort of another issue. The point is just that he is making the party at least superficially more attractive in some ways to the orthodox economic left. But the additional point I would just make is that when we think about what is economic justice, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can interpret that. If we accept the premise that our generation is, as I think is fair, is experiencing sort of unique economic malaise, if the dream of the middle class seems farther off than it was, a generation ago and so on, what is the response to that? And what do we expect how do we expect our politicians to respond? And one thing that I think the Trumpified Republican Party has done in a way that has been attractive to, frankly, some of these left-wing people is that he has been unapologetic, and the intellectuals that enable him have been unapologetic in just sort of going to war against symbols of corporate America, right? Like you see now all the time the Republicans say corporate as a pejorative adjective in front of everything that they say. The corporate media, the corporate this, the corporate Democrats, and as well, they go after things like woke capitalism, right? Like the idea that the companies, these heartless corporations, are just giving us rainbow Oreos and Black Lives Matter T-shirts and this kind of stuff. And it's all just this kind of like superficial nonsense that isn't actually mean anything for any actual working people. And it's, just a bunch of cover for them to go ahead and do their evil capitalist things, right? Like that type of rhetoric you hear as much these days from, the right-wing populists as you do from the left-wing populists. And so again, this becomes another permission structure, right? If you start to define economic justice as merely a kind of like rejection of corporate marketing or corporate propaganda, or like a willingness to kind of do battle with these kind of corporate figureheads and their very high profile, virtue signals or whatever you want to call it, that becomes another possible inroad, right? If we're moving away from a politics that is really as fixated on economic philosophy one way or another, and it's instead just becoming defined by these kind of superficial battles as I would see them, in part because the underlying problems of our modern economy are just too daunting and too intimidating for people on either side to engage with. Well, if that's the nature of the politics, then that style of politics, the politics of doing high profile battle against symbolic embodiments of a distasteful form of modern capitalism, well, yeah, again, a lot of people will find that compelling. But sorry, I went on a wild tangent. Your initial question was that you were asking me about the history. Can you reframe that a bit?
Well, my wager is that I want to ask you about about contrarianism as well. But okay, so just to rephrase the question, because I think this is entangled with neoliberalism and declining quality of life across the advanced world, and productivity and wages being divergent since the 1980s up until now. My sense is that people will not be able to accumulate the property that then causes their party affiliation to shift as it had in years previous. So the Trotskyists who then became the neoconservatives, and maybe for people who are not familiar, because we're using terms neoliberal and neoconservative, we mean quite literally the Reagan administration. The terminology gets very slippery here. But there was a tremendous growing pie and productivity and uninterrupted prosperity. And that is a wonderful thing. It yielded the most prosperous society that has ever existed, and that is I think undeniably a good thing. But it does seem to be a unique period of historical development that may not be possible to replicate. And part of the promise of technologization and platformization and all of these new, say, YouTube and podcasts and iPhones and whatever, there was a hope that through these new technologies, we would recapture that explosive productivity that happened in the post-World War II period. So it's understandable in some ways how people who had those ideas in the 1920s, then by the 1960s and 80s felt very differently, because they were in a really flourishing society, and it was impossible to ignore just we grew up in literally a tenement building of 9 people in a single family home. And now everyone owns a home, has property, has a car, and whatever. But that upward mobility is historically unique. And if now we're in a period where people are again living in intergenerational homes and there's not enough employment and opportunities, I don't know if they can make that same switch. So will the cultural tribal affiliation in your mind be enough to push people over that wedge, or over that leap, if they don't have the property to back it up?
Yeah, so that's a tremendously good way of framing it, and that's a very insightful, I think, rebuttal to some of the premises that my kind of theory is based on. I guess there's just a kind of couple of things that I would say. Like, one thing is that I think I'm not an economist, but I can say that having looked at some of the numbers, I do think that our generation can sometimes get a little self-pitying. I think that we can sometimes get a little overblown in just like, quote unquote, how bad we have it. I think that, yes, by certainly the property metric is, I think, one of like the weirdest outliers. And I'm from Vancouver, which has some of the most expensive and overinflated property prices in the entire world. So like, I don't know anybody who is living in the way that like my parents did at my age, or like, I think when I was a kid, you go on your little play dates and like my friend Matthew, I remember his father was like a furniture salesman and they have like a house with multiple rooms and things like that. Style of middle-class life just seems so far off now. Right. Like, and so that's a very real thing to be sensitive to. And thus sort of to fit into your premise, if that type of middle-class lifestyle is just so unobtainable, then it logically follows that maybe the form of middle-class politics that, say, Matthew's dad had wouldn't necessarily be prevalent in our generation. But that said, I don't think that we are a generation of paupers by any stretch. Like, I don't think that we are so destitute that the life that we live has no resemblance at all to the middle-class material success of our parents' generation. But I want to, I don't want to get too deep into that, because I'm perfectly willing to concede that perhaps things are as bad as they've ever been, and perhaps we are a uniquely indigent, sort of suffering generation. But I guess what I would say in response to that as well is just that if we assume that that is the case, if we are uniquely suffering, well, then there does become a question of like, well, what has the left's response to that been? Has the left offered a viable, attractive political agenda that will continue to be attractive to people as they age and as they, become more sort of settled in their jobs, however unsatisfying those jobs might be? And my argument would be that in many ways, I don't think the left has. So at least like if we're going to say like the capital L, like further to the left of the Democrat of scene, right?
Yeah, yeah. Are we talking AOC or Bernie, or are we talking like Adorno?
No, I know. And I know that sort of in leftist spaces, people are very precious about some of this kind of language. So I want to be sort of sensitive to that.
It gets infinitely granular.
It does.
Yeah.
But let's just kind of say, like, if we're talking about sort of like the populist kind of left-wing sort of Bernie types, AOC types, the podcaster types and whatnot, like, is there political agenda, is there economic agenda in response to the economic malaise of our generation? Is it an attractive one? Or does it come off as just kind of utopian and silly? Like, is their agenda just, well, capitalism sucks, there should be no capitalism? And it's like, okay, like, we can agree with that in theory, but is that an actionable game plan, right? And if it's not, then again, we get to sort of what I'm sort of saying before. Then you're sort of economic justice that manifests in other ways, such as like, the Trumpy appeal to just like the corporations are bad and like, let's get on our high horse and denounce them and make fun of them and that kind of stuff. And then that becomes really the only kind of entrance into a kind of economic justice agenda, even if it is superficial and ridiculous. It's more, that kind of stuff seems more attractive and more relevant to the lives of more people than just saying like capitalism sucks, we should abolish capitalism, or something like that. That's obviously never going to happen.
Right. Yeah. So this is the very peculiar moment that we exist in the discourse, and with a type of party realignment maybe that's happening as well. So frequently discussed on the podcast and the like intellectual milieu, the media ecosystem, maybe is the better term that you're describing. People talk about the professional managerial class, which is, we went back to the original, what was the year? 1970, 1971. John and Barbara Ehrenreich wrote an essay in, is it Radical America? Is that the name of it? Where we looked at the actual definition of the professional managerial class, which is a bit different than how people use it now. But in effect, there is a very pronounced problem today where we have very left-wing rhetoric that seems to be most useful in recuperating, flattering the good nature of wealthy financiers in the nonprofit sector or NGOs or something like that, or journalists or different types of things. So there's a suturing of this very working class, radical socialist rhetoric, and then these ultra elite politics and flows of funding and things like that. And trying to map this out, what it looks like is that there's an alliance on the Democratic side, broadly speaking, the left, or the practical left of how you could politically act, between precarious, freelance slash working class, very much at the bottom of the economic ladder, and the top. And then on the Republican side, there is an alliance between the middle and a different section of the top. So there's this infra ruling class dispute that has picked gerrymandered, maybe is a better term for it, alliances that are very strategic, pitting the middle against the bottom. And it would seem to me that the difficult work of doing the discourse is finding spaces where the bottom and the middle could get some of the resources that have drifted all the way to the top during the neoliberal era. That would seem to be the bridge that you're trying to walk across. There's going to be an unbelievable accumulation of wealth at the very top. Yeah, but I do see what you're getting at. I think there's it's helpful to break this down into. I think this framing comes from Thomas Piketty, where he talks about the Brahmin left, and he talks about the merchant right, where there's a weird kind of NGO clerisy or this rhetoric that is very moralizing and punitive, but then is also next to these very like elite philanthropic flows where you get, like woke mortgages and things like that. And then there's this other type of politics, which is the kind of middle class Republican politics, which has in some ways receded to the background because I think the populist rhetoric is of a lower middle class. I know that you've done some videos breaking down these different gradations as well. But that populist kind of, say, J.D. Vance or heterodox Trump rhetoric is not targeted, I think, at the small business owners on a rhetorical sense, and certainly in like a policy sense, it benefits them less than the ultra elites. But I think that idea of like material security is targeting that very precarious lower middle class.
Yeah.
And so again, I have to return to this framing that, having an alliance with an elite is going to be unsustainable given the rapid decline. And I think it is. I understand. I'm sympathetic to the idea that millennials are sometimes we whine a little bit too much. Like we certainly have it worse than the Xers and the boomers. But I think in terms of extrapolating out some of these curves in the face of catastrophic climate change, the Gen Z kids may have it like really bad. Like we should allow for the possibility that the level of breakdown given extreme weather and fortifying our cities to experience catastrophic floods and stuff like that, that could be a type of breaking point that, leads into a whole slew of other political scenarios.
Yes, and I think it's. I mean, this is sort of a question that I think the left wing has to sort of ask themselves when it comes to an issue like climate change. Like, why is that not priority number one? Like, why are we fighting over economic issues or cultural issues or battling over which Democrat is pure enough and that kind of thing? If this crisis is at such an existential level that it should really, and I think this is something that's quite striking when I talk to younger people, Zoomers, and I'm sure it is as well, to the degree that they view that as basically the central question of politics. Like the dealing with catastrophic climate change is the purpose of politics, right? And so all of this other kind of stuff that we're talking about in a kind of theoretical, roundabout way, seems as quite irrelevant, right? Like that is ultimately not the fundamental cleavage that any political system should be based on. But our generation, as much as we often give lip service to climate change as something that we care a lot about, I just think that when you look at the actual rhetoric, the actual priorities, the actual things that a lot of people within our generation, including people on the left, the right has no interest in this issue at all. But if we're talking about people on the left, right, like how often are they actually making climate change their priority versus, a kind of economic justice agenda or sort of things like that? Issues that they frankly like talking about more. I mean, this is, I think, as somebody who's been in political commentary for a long time, this is always one of like the great challenges, right? Like to what degree are your priorities dictated by simply what you like talking about, what is fun for you to talk about, what you know a lot about personally, and then sort of scratches a kind of intellectual itch in your own mind? And this is like, and it's the same thing with the Democrats, right? Like attacking Democrats. Like you said earlier, like it's fun. It is fun. Republicans say the same thing. Like I remember once hearing an interview with like a talk radio guy where he sort of said like he was a right-wing talk radio guy, and he said, "I'll never do an episode that has better audience engagement than when I'm bashing other Republicans, right? There is something like uniquely satisfying about attacking your own side that people really get a thrill out of, regardless if you're on the right or the left. But the question is, like, is this the best use of our time? And as somebody who's in political commentary myself, like, I do think about this a lot. Like, well, what should I be talking about? And are the issues that matter, are they the ones that I personally like talking about? And if there's a disconnect there, then am I in the wrong line of business, right? It's a challenging game, because in addition, to all of the other sort of economic cultural transformations we're seeing, there has never been a sort of larger class of like public intellectuals, of people like you and I who make a living
yes, that's
just
true.
talking about stuff, right? Like just intellectualizing politics, theorizing politics, gamifying politics, turning it into art or entertainment or whatever else. There's never been a greater time to be a person who engages at politics at that level. But there's always the question of whether or not that is what the world needs the most right now.
It's also the thing that is driving the Democratic Party is in the US should be two different parties, where there should be a Labor Party and then there should be these other interests that are finance or middle class or management. And every political party represents a diverse group of several groups, right? And so the inequalities between the groups that are represented by the Democratic Party is creating something that seems unsustainable to a lot of the people who have been in one or either or of those many groups, right? So there's some contradictions inside of the party structure. I think that there's a major collection of people who are in this role in society, who are working at NGOs or nonprofits or something like that, that is, they are taking a lot of value out of the economy. And it seems to be immiserating a lot of the other people who would be lumped into the Democratic voter base. So yes, that is something that's a real present, and it's going to create a contradiction that will lead to some disastrous results maybe down the line. But the thing that I want to ask you is that I feel like there's a media element of this as well that we are maybe enmeshed in the process, in that say, for example, the pundit class, which would probably be part of this professional managerial, elite aspirant group, they excel in a new media ecosystem that thrives on contrarianisms and grains of sand that become disproportionately magnified. So, for example, if you have very heterodox ideas, you get a larger audience by engaging on this side, but also on that side. And people listen to you, and then they can't quite make sense of you, and they Streisand affect what you're doing. So things that seem or represent like rather small groups, disparate fringe opinions, then get blown up by orders and orders of magnitude. So we end up in a media ecosystem where it's very difficult to index like what is the popular sentiment, and maybe there's an alignment between the punditry class that is very clearly, I think, financially incentivized through the way that this content is monetized to spend, kind of as you said before, like get those ratings, get people in who will click, who will buy, sell ad views, what have you. And they just shit on, if they're from the right, they shit on the right. And if they're from the left, they shit on the left. And this drives another type of polarization where you get this ultra dedicated group that really cares about this thing, but ultimately represents a very small fringe interest or whatever. So this is the funny period too, because we're each in unique positions where we have a foot in the old world of institutional structures or legacy media, and then a foot in the new world. And most people are exclusively in one or the other. So I feel like we have a mirror position here of articulating arguments to the other side, but also having to articulate arguments to your own side. And very often you end up in a situation where the people who are from your side have a tribal identity and are not interested to resolve the problems that ostensibly brought them to this channel to learn more about. And what they want is shitting on the Democrats rather than fixing the issue or something. Yeah. And it's very clear that people who exist only within the platforms like YouTube or podcasts or whatever, they're like fish in water, and they can't understand, they can't really sense how the incentives and the networks, the platforms that they operate within are shaping even the ideas that they can have. They're not aware that they're in a reward system for having these contrarian opinions.
Yes.
And then there's this other like old media or institutional structure that is kind of codified, and it's very hard to break up, and things take a very long time to change. And there's gatekeepers and hierarchies, and there's somebody at the top who will, okay, you are now just kicked out of this organization and you can't find your way up, and it's totally opaque, and it doesn't have those competitive opportunities that the platforms afford, that you can just, if I accumulate more followers and my grain of sand causes more inflammation, then I can attract some interest to my cause and what have you. So let me phrase this as a question to you, because I think you will have some insights on this topic. What are the particular affordances of each of those spaces that you operate in? Is the institutional legacy media structure becoming more like the platforms that you have to write in a sensationalist clickbait type of way? Or is the discourse on the platforms becoming more institutional, that it requires more research, more citations, and more fact checkers? What do you find are the particular affordances of discourse in either of those spaces?
That's a very good question. And I do think that in some ways they are coming to resemble each other more and more, and that they are becoming less and less distinct spaces, and that the rules that govern success in one are increasingly applicable to the other. I just wrote a piece for the Washington Post, a very esoteric Canadian issue, I suppose, about why our beloved Queen Elizabeth II should perhaps think about resigning. And it's like, was that the most important issue in the world? Probably not. But I kind of had a sense that it would probably play well. It would get some clicks. It was a little provocative. And, I'm sensitive. I want to do a good job for my editors and get stuff, and I'll do a dry column on some esoteric Canadian thing next week, right? So like there does become a sort of sense where there, and I know this from having worked in sort of conventional media, that everybody's consuming these, even though in theory it's something like the Washington Post is a newspaper, the majority of people are consuming it online. And so it becomes, subject to the traditional, rules of the online marketplace. But then on the other hand, when I make an article or when I make a video for YouTube, I know that there is a lot more accountability in that space, because that space is now getting much more crowded with very serious thinkers who will make long, thoughtful videos on serious, important social and political topics. And if you do a bad job, because the ecosystem is so robust now, not only from the audience, but from fellow creators, like if you play fast and loose with your facts, you will be called out the same way that if somebody publishes a bunch of crap in the Washington Post, they'll be called out. People will make rebuttal videos or write long essays sort of deconstructing all the things you got wrong. So the accountability is very strong, I think, in the YouTube space right now. Like, is there a lot of misinformation? Sure, there is. But a lot of that misinformation will also be explicitly called out. So I do think, there is accountability there in a way that, the kind of the stereotypical view of YouTube is just, a hive of cat videos or whatever. I think that's kind of an outdated assumption. In the same way, though, frankly, if we're going to take shots at the mainstream media, I think there is a lot of sensationalism in the mainstream media now. And I often feel that as much as people talk about what is the dominant bias in the media, is it a left-wing bias, is it a right-wing bias, corporatist bias, whatever. I often think that sensationalism, which I think in many ways transcends ideology, is really the most pervasive bias that you see in the press. I would say, as somebody that's worked in mainstream media organizations for a very long time, there's a lot of competitiveness. A lot of these organizations are bleeding money. Anytime I ever talk to like an editor or a corporate person on the side of the corporate media, like the biggest anxiety they have is just how hard it is to make money, right? And then the only way that you sort of recuperate from that is by by burying your competitors, by getting more clicks, by getting more eyeballs, and that becomes very transactional and sensationalistic. So
it's an arms race.
It is absolutely an arms race, right? Yeah. And it's not it's not about just like, this kind of Chomskyan idea of like manufacturing consent or whatever. Like a lot of it is just like, well, what do the public want? Like, will they click on this? Is this the kind of thing? Does it have characters that they know and relate to? If I write an article and it has like Justin Trudeau in the headline, like that'll get more clicks because he's like a character and people have strong feelings about him one way or the other. So the main conclusion is, yes, that the two different forms of media, new media and old media, they're not so different. They're
becoming, the introduction of fact checkers and what used to be more of a competitive playing field on the platforms is becoming more institutional. And there are more parameters, obviously the Overton window, there's a narrowing window of what you can say politically on the platforms. And Yeah, they are converging. They are converging. But for a while, they were very, very different. And I think that what I have come to in the last few years is that these platforms are in some ways responsible for the erosion of the middle class. And there's a media layer to it, but there's also a financial layer in that shopping malls that would employ people are then replaced by Amazon. And a medallion license for like a yellow cab or something in New York that would previously be akin to a mortgage and a pathway to the middle class life. This is now devalued so intensely by being outcompeted by Uber that it evacuates the possibility for economic mobility and a middle class life for many of those people. This is the other side of it. I haven't fully figured this out yet, but I feel like we are, in some ways, we're running the risk of naturalizing sensationalism and the media ecosystem that we currently exist in. Like sharing a sensationalist article or something like that. That definitely happens, and people do it all the time, and they follow a lot of their worst instincts, and the internet is libidinal, and it's got porn and violence and outrageous things, and all of that exists. But I also imagine if there was an internet where you had to pay to post, for example, just as a silly thought experiment, if it cost you 5 cents every time you shared a sensationalist article, would you do it? Would it run in the same way? Because I feel like this infinite chasing of scale has resulted in creating a bad media ecosystem, which is inflaming the very real middle class antagonisms that both you and I are interested to preserve. And so there's one of these Jenga blocks needs to be pulled loose. Either we got to have a serious overhaul of the financial system and the possibility for stability and opportunity, or we need to like wipe out the media system. I guess that's what the new like fact check regime of social media is attempting to reconstitute, right? That it's actually gotten way out of control and it needs to be reeled back in, and there's got to be some type of consensus reality, because otherwise we're shredding the social fabric and we're balkanizing into these really fringe atomized groups that don't share a consensus. And all of that is a media problem, but the media problem on top of the real financial problem, the economic problem, is like converges on crisis.
Well, you know,
right?
one thing that sort of popped into my mind as you were saying that, Joshua, is something that I've been sort of thinking about a lot, particularly as it relates to America. And this even connects back to what I was just sort of saying about the political parties and all of that. Is, you know, we in many ways, I think, and I think this is something the left will often not concede, but I think that we live in a quite remarkably democratic age in a sort of small d sense, in the sense of like how much power your individual has over determining the course of and the direction of so many large institutions, be they political parties, be they the media, be they these large tech companies, and so on and so forth. The problem is, though, that I think that you realize, and this is something that's hard for me to grapple with because I like to think of myself as a very pro small d Democrat kind of type of person. If you think of like how, if the public is given tremendous control of these kinds of institutions, do they inevitably drift in the direction of sensationalism or extremism or just kind of like thoughtless, know-nothing populism? Because at the end of the day, that seems to be what some critical mass of the public actively wants. Like, if you completely democratize your political parties,
They want civil war. They want to LARP civil war.
I wouldn't go that far per se, but perhaps some of them do. I mean, geez Louise, if you're a Republican and you like run in a primary saying like, let's kill all the Democrats, you probably would get some decent support for saying that, right? Like that there is a sort of, in the same way that, you know, if you produce like the most deranged form of pornography or whatever, like it'll probably skyrocket to the top of the charts, right? Like there is a degree to which if you create institutions that are solely accountable to the public, they will decay in a kind of repulsive direction, it seems. And this is a very difficult thing to concede because we don't want to, but it's hard to concede because there are these two positions that so many people on both the right and the left in all sort of flavors of extremism or moderation just have a hard time reconciling with, which is this idea that like everybody wants to be anti-elite, but everybody also doesn't want the mob to be in complete control. And I really do feel that this is the biggest challenge of our time in some ways, is how can we get a balance between, you know, a mob that we fear and hate and don't trust, and elites who we also fear and hate and don't trust. And I think it is very easy for people to just kind of use like let the people rule, like more democratization as a kind of like, kind of airy hand wave kind of thing. But I think there's a lot of ways in which you can look at contemporary America and you can say, there are problems that are being caused in our contemporary society that are precisely the effect of the public having as much power as they do. It's hard to concede because everybody wants to believe that the public is wise and that the public is, virtuous and the public is always on, quote unquote, our side. And that if we could just give the public more power, they would sort of sort everything out for themselves. But I don't know. I just think that that's often not the case. And I think that when we talk about the sensationalism of the media, the decay of the Republican Party or conservative politics in general, I would say, I think that a lot of this does come down to very high degrees of public control, as opposed to the kind of conventional belief that it's just kind of some sort of shadowy elite kind of puppeteering the masses to do things they don't want to do.
I think, well, when you say that there are more opportunities for small d democratic input, I'm taking that to mean opportunities to voice your opinion on social media, to post on YouTube, to have your message heard by a large
audience. And to vote with your pocketbook, I would say, or to vote literally in democratic elections, right?
Vote, where to spend your money, things like that. I think so. But I think people have less money to spend than they did in eras previously. And I think boycotts are, it's difficult to boycott when the necessary goods for survival are so expensive. It's difficult to boycott your rent. People literally do that and they organize a tenants union or something like that. And those are some of the more successful organizing activities that people have gotten up to in recent years. But it's very difficult to really meaningfully boycott for an extended period of time. My sense is that the cleavage within the Democratic Party between those two groups that have now diverging interests, the discourse that we're seeing privileged in these platform spaces is a result of that financial economic divergence between the two groups, in that you get things that are very cancely, very woke, very ways to take out the competition that is maybe one rung above you, and then you get a little bit of upward mobility in whatever employment or institutional context that you're living in. But I don't think that people really have a meaningful democratic input. I think you can be very loud and you can expose your message to a lot of people, but I think it mostly doesn't have an effect. It's kind of like screaming into a closet. And so the only thing that really does have an effect, because there's such a narrowing window of opportunity for upper middle class life or even just middle class life, is that people are becoming extremely cutthroat and really vicious in these elite sectors of society. And then they take to things like podcasts and they take to things like social media and they inflame and they antagonize and they create sensationalist accusations and attempt to smear the reputations of people who are between them and the elite position that they desire. So, yeah, that is this is the classic criticism of woke capital and the PMC. But we're almost at the hour. I want to throw a question to you. Given the conceit of your article, which I think mostly I agree with, that there are people, I don't think that they should have a real affiliation to the Democratic Party. And if their interests were better represented by Republicans, then I would encourage them to vote that way. My real skepticism is, given the economic prospects of our advanced society, I think things are going to get very bad. I'm calibrating for the worst. And I think people may not be able to accumulate the wealth and property necessary to have something to safeguard, unfortunately. And I hope that I'm wrong about that. What would you say would be the biggest hurdle to people making that party crossover? What would be in the way of those disenfranchised left-wingers joining a Republican coalition?
Well, I would think that certainly climate change in theory should be one of the biggest obstacles. I think it'll be interesting to see how central the fight for abortion rights becomes, because the Republican Party has become so extreme on that issue, so uncompromising.
Yes.
But on the other hand, I also do think it is true, that being said, that like what we were talking about before, where a lot of people of our generation are perhaps a little turned off by sort of the modern LGBT rights, by trans rights, and so on and so forth. I think that a lot of Americans are far more moderate on the abortion question than I think is often kind of fashionable to concede. Even people that vote Democrat, that there's kind of a more kind of sensible middle of the road position that is probably closer than a kind of like extreme, sort of like what we have here in Canada, where just like anything goes.
And we may see there's been a few commentators from the Republican media side that have said that they will vote Democrat if abortion is the only issue in the midterms.
Yes.
So that very well could happen.
No, very much. And so there's a lot to sort of see how the two parties will sort of attempt to calibrate themselves in a kind of post-Roe era. But definitely like climate change as well. That is particular to like the really young people. I mean, that it doesn't, as long as that becomes a front and center issue, like as long as like the Democrat Party is in some ways branded as being the party that's serious about climate change, and then the Republican Party is the party that is not, like I do think that becomes a very difficult chasm to cross.
Are these guys really serious about climate change?
Well, I don't know. I mean, see, like, well, see,
I don't know.
There we go, right? Like,
is anybody serious about it?
Well, see that, and see like that. This is very important, right? Like, if the dominant sort of narrative becomes that, well, this is not really an issue that's being adjudicated in the political process one way or another, then you can kind of put it aside, and then you can fight it over the issues that are being adjudicated by the political process, which may be nothing more than who hates Jeff Bezos more, or whatever, right? Like this kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm hopeful that a giant jobs creation program in the form of maybe it's not the Green New Deal, maybe it's something similar in the future, but this is, it rolls all these things into one, where it creates the jobs, it creates economic opportunity for a declining middle class, and it makes the best attempt at confronting the climate situation that we have.
The challenge is
ultimately a very long road.
Sorry. And just one thing, like the challenge ultimately for people like you, people that have an interest in promoting that kind of political vision, is marketing, right? Like this is something that I think the left wing often does not want to admit, is that they are very bad at marketing, right? Like they have a hard time selling their big ambitious agenda that may very well be good for the betterment of the country and the world. But, they have to come up with a way to make it persuasive and attractive to these kind of moderate swing voters in the middle, in the suburbs, the boomers, the surviving remnants of the middle class, right? Like you have to be able to make an argument that is attractive to them, because we see that ultimately is the group. Like there are people in America who, do not perceive the Republican Party and the Democratic Party the way that we do. They perceive it according to a whole host of other stereotypes and cliches and dated assumptions and whatnot. So you have to be able to make a pitch that kind of concedes some of their priors, as opposed to only making a pitch that is attractive to other podcasters or whatever, right? It's the challenge of retail politics of marketing, and marketing in a democratic society, like it or not, is a huge component part of politics.
There's other ways that this works as well, too, that Clinton was able to eviscerate welfare in a way that Reagan never could. A lot of times these parties pick up on the proposals of the other. And one of my favorite contrarianisms is that the Republicans are going to be the ones to pass a national health service, because this will actually be an austerity measure, in that Americans are spending way too much on their healthcare. And we're going to have to do, all of us, the great owners of industry in American society and at the seat of the table for the Republicans, we're going to have to do a little bit of belt tightening. And Bob, who owns all of the healthcare industry in the US, is very bloated and is taking too much off the table. So he's got to leave a larger piece of the pie for everyone. And what that results in is cost saving for the consumers and larger profits for everybody else at the table. But if that happens through the Republican Party rather than the Democrats, it's it becomes an interesting, twisted, labyrinthian maze.
Sounds like old man Joshua has come up with his permission structure to start voting Republican.
I don't know if I'll, if there's somebody from the DSA Red Caucus that, runs on the Republican ticket, I would have no hesitation. But otherwise, I don't have, I have affiliations to causes, but I don't have party affiliations, is my sense. JJ, thank you for making the time to chat. This has been super interesting. Yeah, it's a blast, and I'm now just a parasocial fan of your content because I've really enjoyed watching your videos and everything.
Same
So,
with me.
Do you want to give a few plugs? And I'm sure people are familiar with your work on YouTube, but what else do you have coming?
Yeah, basically that's it. And I'm on YouTube. I'm on the Washington Post. If you Google my name, I'm sure that you'll be able to find that stuff without too much trouble. And like I said, Joshua, we're like right back at you. I've become a big fan of your content. I think you're an amazing, creative individual who's doing remarkable things. So I wish you nothing but the best.
Greetings, you Matrix One.